Going to have a little chat about the week 3 activities in managerial accounting. So in week 3, the focus is on activity-based costing. And the goal is that by the end of this week that you've reviewed the materials that are in the activity-based costing chapter, which is chapter 4. And I'm also going to assign an article for you to read, which is called Measure Cost Right, Make the Right Decision. These two things go hand in hand. So activity-based costing really revolutionized the way that we go about costing products and services in the United States. Up to this point, we had what is often called, and is certainly called in the textbook, a traditional costing approach. So the traditional costing approach was one that where we took the 3 elements of cost: direct material, direct labor, and overhead, and had a methodology to apportion each to the cost object. And the cost object is anything that we want to know the cost of. So for example, if I were to be building a smartphone for Apple, my direct material cost would be the components that go into building, the iPhone 6 or the iPhone 7. The direct labor would be the time that the people who build that particular device spend actually assembling the device, the iPhone 6 or the iPhone 7. And then the indirect cost would be those costs that are what we might call overhead costs. And so in traditional costing, what we did is we put all the overhead costs into one bucket, and we picked out one cost driver, typically something like volume or direct labor hours or direct labor dollars, and we said, okay, that one cost driver we'll use as a basis to apportion all of overhead costs. And so we came up with a methodology to apportion all of the costs to the cost objects. And this is the traditional method, what we call full absorption costing. What activity-based costing recognizes that our costing systems using that oversimplified approach for indirect costs was producing inaccurate results. And when we produce inaccurate results for cost, then the problem is that we prompt management to make bad decisions. So when you think about what do we use cost as a basis for, we use cost as a basis for many key decisions: to set price, to determine the profit or loss on a particular product or service. We use it as a basis to figure out how much we're going to assign to a particular department in terms of cost assignment and so forth. So there's many, many decisions. Should we accept a special offer? Should we make something or buy something? So if we get cost wrong, then think about the plethora of decisions that we could possibly get wrong, and often do get wrong. And so what activity-based costing basically said was that, look, how we apportion direct material and direct labor is fundamentally fine. So there's really no change to that. And in those particular cases, we look at direct labor and we figure out how much time does somebody spend assembling a product or a service, and how much do we pay them? And we can pretty much nail that without too much problem. And with direct labor, pretty much fundamentally, we can list out what's in the bill of materials, or we can figure out how much each part cost, and we can sum that up, and we can arrive at a good number. But with overhead, it becomes trickier. So the prescription in activity-based costing is to break out the major elements of overhead, and then look at each element of overhead and figure out, does the service or product that we're building consume that particular element of overhead? And if it does, how do we determine the cost driver? So for example, one of the traditional elements of overhead is rent, and when I look at rent, square footage is a good cost driver. So pretty straightforward. I look at something like depreciation. Let's say that most of that is being driven by equipment that we have in a particular facility. Then what I should look at and ask is, if I have 3 or 4 products, do they all consume that depreciation equally? And if they don't, then I have to make sure that I only apportion the depreciation to those products or services that are actually utilizing those pieces of equipment, as opposed to having that one big bucket where everything goes in. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And that's fundamentally the big change between activity-based costing and the in the traditional approach. And while it may seem simple, it also produces a pretty profound change in what things cost. And so if we change what things cost, then what we end up doing is making different decisions. And if we make things different, if we make different decisions, then we help the organization. We help the organization make better decisions, and that's really what we're after. We're after helping the organizations make better decisions. Okay, so let me go through a few of the lecture slides, and so the first thing we have to come to grips with is why is understanding cost essential in all organizations? And so as I flip through these slides, you'll see basically we're after the same objective, which is to help organizations and decision makers make the right business decisions. And what decisions to rely on to using cost as a basis. So every organization is a little different, but essentially if we look at this plethora of decision-making, break even, pricing strategies, profit or loss, make versus buy, add or drop a segment, etc., we can see that cost is an important element of many, many key decisions. And it's essential that we get cost right. So if we get cost wrong, then we put our organization at a competitive disadvantage, or worse, we could be catastrophic. Right? If we underprice or overprice a particular product, if we outsource something when we shouldn't have, or vice versa, all these things can have a major, if not catastrophic, impact on our organization. So we want to be very careful and make sure that we really understand what something truly costs. So we've talked about the major categories of cost and the major elements of cost that are broken up into these major categories: direct material, direct labor, and overhead. So here's a little more detail about what each of those means. This is right in the slide, so I'm not going to read these to you, but keep in mind that we're not really changing anything between traditional activity-based costing when it comes to direct material and direct labor. It's really this overhead and indirect that we're attacking in a different way. So we're breaking out the major elements, and then we're looking at the different products and services that we make or provide, and then we're trying to figure out how each of these elements of overhead or indirect cost are used by the cost objects that we are making or producing. So, okay, so what else is important? So we've talked about examples in class, but if we look at there are so many things that use cost as a basis, and at the end of the day, what we're really after is to make sure that we get cost right, and we recognize that activity-based costing is a key tool and a key resource. So the other thing I want to point out to everybody is that the traditional costing system is fundamentally, the main departure comes in just that one element that we talked about. But the criticism of traditional costing is that it distorted cost information. And when we distort cost information, as I've said, and said many times over and over again, we end up with the potential for bad decisions. So the textbook does a nice job walking through the traditional versus activity-based costing, and that's these are the major things. So the other major thing that I want to point out to you is that I've asked you to look at an article which is in the essential read folder, and that's called "Measure Cost Right, Make the Right Decision." So that article was written actually in the late 1980s. So it's been around for more than 25 years, but it was the basis for the activity-based costing movement. And also, what the learnings that we get out of that still apply today. So even though the article is relatively old, what we have to keep in mind is that the wisdom that that article brought us was something that is still applicable today. And so I want you to look carefully at that article, and I want you to think about what the authors, Cooper and Kaplan, are saying as you read through that article. And at the end of the day, I think what you'll find is that that article does a much better job than I can do in terms of articulating why this is important, and certainly vastly superior to what the textbook does. So if you have to make a decision between reading the textbook or reading the article, strong preferences that you do both. But the article, I think, has much more powerful information, and something that I think you'll get something lasting and beneficial from. So I'm trying to pull up the. Let me see if I can just share the screen. So in the course materials under Essential Read, at the top is something called Measure Cost Right. And when you open that up, it's going to say Measure Cost Right and Make the Right Decision. It was published in the Harvard Business Review in 1988. So don't let the age of this article fool you. This really has been a movement within the accounting profession, this activity-based costing. And this was the genesis of that movement. And I think that as you read through this, you'll see there's a lot of wisdom in the article. So they talk about focusing on expensive resources, emphasize the resources where consumption varies significantly by product, and focus on resources whose demand patterns are uncorrelated with traditional allocation methods like direct labor, processing time, and materials. So, and again, they're talking primarily about the overhead costs, not the direct material and direct labor. They talk about some other things in here too, dealing with capacity, because one of the issues we have is that what happens if we're only utilizing 50% of our capacity? Do we still assign all of the cost to the cost object? And in their view, and I fundamentally agree with it, we should not. We should classify, if we're only utilizing 50 or 75% of our capacity, we should classify the unutilized capacity as just that. It's underutilized capacity. And so if you think about that, what that means is that when I look at my indirect cost and how much I apportion to the cost objects, it assumes that I'm operating at full capacity. And then I take that difference and I period expense it. So, all right, so I'm going to host another session on Wednesday evening. I'm sorry, Wednesday evening, on Sunday evening at 6. But if you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to me. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.